Okay, let me bring in my next guest. It's Dr. Hannah Brown. Hannah is an Adelaide-born, greetings from Adelaide, Adelaide-born, globally trained executive leader at the intersection of research, innovation, and impact. As Chief Idea Sparkler, founder and CEO of Sparkle Ideas Lab, she helps organisations cut through the noise, make sense of complexity, and turns bold ideas into real-world change. Her career spans leadership of the South Australian Research and Development Institute, SARDI, as Executive Director, and Strategy, Innovation and Operations at the Victorian Heart Institute. Her topic today is fascinating. It says, what if the very traits we've been told to fix could actually be the strengths the future leaders need the most? Which somebody had said that to me and recognised that in my career. May I introduce Dr. Hannah Brown? And yeah, let's hear all about your work, Hannah.
Great. Thank you so much, Rob. And look, firstly, I guess I want to start by saying it is a true privilege to have been invited by ADHD Australia to share this story and talk about this work. For about the last 12 months or so, I guess, I've been working on a project about leadership and specifically, I guess, a project on ADHD and leadership. And I guess, well, perhaps subconsciously, I've been working on this project for maybe 42 years, but for most of it, I didn't actually know it was a project on ADHD and leadership. That was a more recent discovery. But it's actually the first time that I'm presenting this work and this concept. Which is both super exciting and completely and utterly terrifying. And while I've had the privilege of sharing many, many stories over my career, perhaps none have been as deeply embedded in personal and lived experience as this one. So I will do my best to share something that's a bit new and a bit unpolished, but that's probably on brand for ADHD, I think. So like many others, I want to start also by acknowledging the traditional owners. And I recognise that we are reaching a global audience, and so it's perhaps relevant to provide a fraction more context than I might ordinarily. So for people who are not from Australia who are watching this, you may not know that the lands here in Australia have been lived on by Australia's First Nations people for at least 65,000 years, recognising them as the world's oldest continuing living culture. I personally want to acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the lands that I live and work on here on the Adelaide Plains, and it's a little sort of pink box down the bottom, and pay my respect to their elders past and present. I think I want to acknowledge specifically their role as leaders. They're clearly over 65,000 years, our nation's first leaders here in Australia, and likely our nation's first neurodivergent people. And I think it's just also really important to acknowledge that there is persistent and frankly unacceptable health inequities experienced by First Nations people. And I just want to express my commitment to continuing to be an advocate for systemic and intersectional inclusion and equity and change until that isn't the case anymore. So let's get started. I think thinking about how to actually sort of set up this concept of ADHD and leadership, I thought it might be useful to provide a little bit of context about my own career and experience, because it's kind of formed the basis for some of the work that I'm going to talk about today. And so what I've learned across many discussions with ADHDers over the last 12 months or so, but actually probably longer than that, is that many of us have what others might describe as or consider to be, unconventional or non-traditional career pathways. So I started my career as a scientist. I worked predominantly in women's health, working in France, in the United States, before returning home to Australia. And I guess now what I probably better understand was a search for a fresh dopamine hit. My science career had kind of transitioned to the kind of scientist that makes discoveries at the bench, to the kind of scientist that spent a lot of time sitting at their desk, a lot of long hours writing papers, that had very limited experience supporting big, complex teams, and one who was experiencing a high level of constant feedback that I probably wasn't doing academia right. And so I left it behind for a role as the chief science storyteller at a local medical research institute, also based here in Adelaide, with, I guess, on paper, none of the required skills, but the confidence that I could probably learn them, most of them on the internet, because I didn't know at that point I had ADHD, but I definitely had the confidence that I could learn new things. I ended up leading a whole range of different portfolios in that business that were responsible for sort of telling the stories of science to basically every audience that we touched, to scientists, politicians, funders, donors, the community, the whole 9 yards. I guess fueled by the willingness to do hard things, I accepted an offer to be employee one of a brand new medical research institute in Melbourne. And over three years, we turned the back of an envelope startup idea into a fully thriving, scaled up health innovation ecosystem, which was super exciting. And we opened that inside the nation's first and only heart hospital in 2023. And after almost 3.5 years of what was very extraordinarily rewarding work, but during the pandemic in Melbourne, which was probably the worst timing of my career, it was time to come back to Adelaide, and I accepted an executive role in state government. I snuck in an MBA along the way, mostly during the long pandemic lockdown weekends, which I thought was, I was clearly very opportunistic there, and I thought I needed a business degree to do the kind of work that I was starting to deliver, and those kind of skills weren't a focus of my early academic training. And then at the end of 2024, at the end of last year, I spun out my own company, the Sparkle Ideas Lab. And I guess in the last couple of years, I also got an ADHD diagnosis. There were signs. There were definitely signs. Some of them I think I ignored, and I think other people probably ignored them too. Some of them I had no idea were signs, and I've learnt a lot since that diagnosis time. Some of them were undeniable, I think, and for me it's been absolutely transformational in terms of better understanding myself, and I think learning to stop apologising for the things that are completely outside of my control, and learning to start to capitalise on the things that are unique strengths and attributes. So the story around this actual leadership project, I guess it's ultimately one that a bunch of people might actually be familiar with, and that is the reality of finding yourself in a very non-neuro-affirming or enabling environment. You may also perhaps have been faced with the reality that you are too much of something or not enough of something else for a particular work environment that you found yourself in, and that was kind of my experience. Prior to my diagnosis, I probably would have questioned whether this kind of reality and experience was because I was female, maybe because I was a bisexual woman married to a woman. That explained why I perhaps felt like I didn't quite fit in amongst my C-suite colleagues. Following my diagnosis, and I guess following a really, really challenging time in my career, I found myself asking whether it was ADHD that was the thing that meant that I would, in my eyes in that moment, never be a great leader. So I did, I guess, what any desperate, late diagnosed, PhD trained woman with ADHD might do. I went straight to Google. I Googled obsessively, actually, maybe expertly, with a PhD and a decade of academic experience, ADHD, female leadership, and found almost nothing. Don't ask me what I was looking for in that moment, but I certainly didn't find it. I felt isolated, I felt alone, I felt stranded, and I was sad. I refined the terms, I adjusted the filters, still almost nothing. I was frustrated. What was I doing wrong? Was it my brain failing me again? Was I actually not good? You know, I'd gaslit myself thinking I was not actually good at the things I'd trained to do over decades. And then enter the old ADHD hyperfocus, a few sleepless 3 a.m. nights, these 3 a.m. research sprints, and the truth kind of emerged to me, I think, that it was actually just really a game of probabilities. I think we know that there's a leadership diversity problem. There's, there's plenty of research that confirms that that's the case. This pale, stale, male dilemma has been thoroughly dissected in basically every area of leadership. And so even before you add the ADHD equation to the equation, the odds of, I guess, are already stacked against women finding their way into leadership, but me having found something that resonated when I hopped onto the internet. So I guess multiply that by the reality, some of which we've already heard about today, of the fact that women are more likely to be misdiagnosed or undiagnosed with their ADHD. With evidence suggesting that maybe 80% of us are missed by the system. Then I guess factor in the stigma, the masking, the lack of role models, the social penalty for someone being willing to sort of jump up and say, yes, this is me, and that being a publicly recognised thing for the rest of their career. And then there's, of course, the old everyone's got ADHD today kind of dismissiveness. And I guess, let's be real, there's one more variable, and this is the one I think is probably the most amusing, and that is that we ADHDers, I speak for myself, but for many people I've spoken to, is that we're ideas people. We win prizes for our ideas, in fact, things like Nobel Prizes, but rarely actually win prizes for finishing things. I'm personally not very good at finishing anything, particularly when the shine wears off. And so I think the odds of someone like me, a woman in leadership with ADHD, willing to own it publicly and then write about it in the public domain so that I would have found it in my moment of weakness, honestly, it's probably just like rolling a cupful of sixes in the Yahtzee. So that's kind of where the project started. It really was a passion project to begin with, to repair, I guess, a bit of a broken heart and a massive broken ego. And it kind of started to grow legs. I was reading, I was writing, I was doing more reading, I was doing more writing. And at one point I sort of had this realization, maybe a moment of insight, maybe a moment of weakness, I'm not sure, that it kind of actually felt a bit more like sort of throwing on the handbrake and skidding along the road, where I realized that I felt like I was learning a lot. I was learning a lot about myself. I was learning a lot about leadership. And I realized that my experiences were kind of only that. They were my own. And while that was useful, and lots that I'd learned really were helping to explain what I didn't understand about my ADHD, I realized at that moment that I didn't actually understand the difference between my personality and ADHD. And while that isn't really a problem for the most part, and something that I've never really cared about and may not ever as we move forward, I think that the necessity to dissect those things was important when I was thinking about sharing some of the things that I was finding, and the risk of sharing nothing but these traits about my personality felt immensely egocentric. And so I thought, well, the best way to resolve that would be to speak to a bunch of people, to learn from others about their experiences, and then start to think about how we could share those. So that's exactly what I did. I reached out actually to ADHD Australia, and off the back of that reach out, spoke to more than now 150 ADHD leaders, and also some extraordinary allies leading both businesses and quite neurodiverse teams along the way. So leadership's a really interesting concept. And I think when people hear the word leader, they often picture someone maybe sitting in a corner office in a skyscraper with a big title, a bigger ego maybe, and perhaps even a car park with their name on it. But leadership doesn't just live at the top of an org chart. I think leadership's less about job titles and more about moments. And it's a behaviour or a collection of behaviours, and it happens everywhere, in community meetings, at the lab bench, in hospital corridors, during startup brainstorms, like even at the dinner table. I think it's highly distributed, it's messy, and it's deeply human. And I think what's also interesting is that it doesn't require a team or direct reports. It doesn't need to be formalized or publicly recognized. And I think what was common to many ADHD leaders I spoke to was that while they recognize their own actions as leadership, although as we sort of dove into that, perhaps not as it's been historically, as leadership's been historically defined, but they commonly described not thinking of themselves as leaders and not seeing themselves as leaders, which I thought was really, really interesting. And I think starting to unpack why that was the case was really illuminating. And there were lots of examples. Some people like mine had an experience where they were told that they were too much or of something, in my case, too nice or too mothering or too a whole range of things, or too little of something else which someone had perceived as a leadership trait that they didn't have. Some people identified having participated in leadership training and having learned that what was expected of them was probably not what they were doing, or different to what they considered made them a great leader. Some people described that they had like totally bombed on the sort of leadership psychometric testing, those tests that are designed to tell some people, not sure entirely who, but probably not people who are neurodivergent, that they are great leaders. And then, of course, there's that old adage of you can't be what you can't see. Many people, I guess, identified that they hadn't seen evidence that leading their way was how other people had risen to positions of influence. But what was really common was this perception and this belief that leadership was an action, and not always a title. The team bit wasn't essential, that was clear. And it was possible to display leadership in a whole range of different ways that had nothing to do with the number of direct reports you had. Clearly, I think, and probably really, I don't know if it's unique to ADHD or not, having it as my personal lived experience, but what was super interesting was the fundamental concept that the responsibility was to enable others. So, I think one of the most common themes for discussion was sort of, I guess, particularly around leadership, was around leadership traits and strengths. And not just because I had sort of asked people, I was really keen to articulate what these were and why it was and what it was that made us tremendous leaders, because I genuinely believed this was the case. And I knew a bunch of people who had ADHD who were tremendous leaders. And I think the challenge is that decades of medical, really limited medical and deficit theory on ADHD in the public discourse, and external negative criticism of our own behaviours. The evidence suggests that there may be 100,000 or so of these before we become teenagers. From both, I guess, this thinking from me and from others about, and the reality is also, I guess, our own very highly critical internal monologue means that most of us are really familiar with feedback that zeroes in on deficits, and other people use them because they're easy to point out to, too distracted, too blunt, too intense, to something that's not perceived to be good. There's another reason that a strengths-based approach might resonate for us too, and that is that a strengths-based approach doesn't assume one ideal way of being. Like, you don't have to be one particular thing. And I think traditional sort of psychometric and other analyses often imply a hierarchy of traits, that this particular thing is better than something else, that, for example, extroverts make better leaders, or planners are more reliable than people who are spontaneous or improvisers. But a strengths-based approach, in contrast, celebrates the diversity of the contribution. Your top 5 aren't judged against someone else's, they're actually celebrated as your own unique advantage. And I think for neurodivergent leaders who may, I guess, never see themselves in that sort of corporate traditional stereotype of a model leader, a strengths-based approach can be really validating and very motivating. And I think the other thing is that a strengths-based approach, it sort of encourages conversation and co-design rather than prescription. And so the goal isn't to pigeonhole you, but to start, a really important dialogue. How do we use or capitalize on what energizes you and what's good? And so I think that framing aligns with the reality of neurodivergent work, that success, I guess, often depends less on fixing weaknesses, but more on designing environments where strengths can flourish and sort of those friction points can be supported or avoided. And the reality that it's the system that's desperately in need of fixing or repair and not us. And there was, I guess, one other thing that was very common in these discussions, and it would probably be remiss of me not to reflect on it at least briefly, and that is the learnings around toxic positivity. And in particular, the use of terms like superpower or gift or genius. And you may all be flinching as I say some of those things. And some people may have a really strong positive relationship with them. But I think what felt common to some of these conversations was that people identified that it was possible to both recognize and value strength whilst also not over celebrating and creating an environment of really toxic positivity where it wasn't necessary. That it was possible to accept and completely independent of neurotype, whether people are neurotypical or fit any sort of neurodivergent, fit into any neurodivergent group. That we all have a plate of things that we excel at, and we probably have a handful of things that we aren't great at that we probably wouldn't win a prize for. And that, I guess, a consistent positioning amongst ADHD leaders that I spoke to was the desire to really avoid that toxic positivity as a tool to sort of mask the things we don't do well, or to cover as an excuse the things we aren't particularly good at. And for the most part, I think the reality is we're already very aware of those things. Those most often don't come as surprises to us. And so, I think, and I guess those things are often commonly exacerbated by systems and structures that we're forced to use that don't serve us, that exist in workplaces and in environments. And so recognizing strengths and starting to enable conversations about, what's hard is what leadership actually looks like. So this bit makes me nervous because it's the first time I've talked about it, and I think, but we're going to give it a roll because I realized I needed to pull all of these findings together into something that people could start to grab onto and start to use. And so when I first started talking to leaders with ADHD, it was sort of immediately apparent that while their stories, I guess our stories, were different, the patterns were really familiar. I heard stories of leadership that could ignite a room, but perhaps struggled to keep it burning long term. I heard stories from ADHD leaders that questioned every rule, often before other people realised that there were rules or that they were there to be broken. There were ADHD leaders who felt so strongly or so deeply that it hurt, and also, I guess, had the skills to build teams that were so well connected that these people would walk through fire for them. There were leaders who couldn't sit still, unsurprisingly, perhaps, until anything was moving. And then there were extraordinary ADHD leaders whose quiet power was not in what they achieved alone, but in their ability to draw the extraordinary from others. And so as it started as a collection of traits, actually a big long list. It started, and then because I'm a science nerd, it turned into an Excel file and a PowerPoint and a whole range of other things. And I knew I needed to start to understand this collection of strengths and traits and attributes better. And so I started to read about them. I knew some of them were well characterized and described and researched. I knew, it turns out that some of these others weren't. And interestingly, sometimes it was the conversation between myself and someone else where we could actually see the light bulb moments happening, where we sort of simultaneously came to the realization that this thing that we knew that we did, that we, maybe sometimes it was like a secret single behavior we hadn't really told anyone else about, was actually something that was quite common to a whole range of ADHD leaders. And I had those moments with people on a regular basis throughout discussions, and they were often there were a lot of revelations during these discussions. And as the list got longer, I continued to sort of trawl the literature to look for more evidence that these things were real. There were more interviews, more conversations, more evidence. And I think making the most of my ADHD ability to find clarity in chaos that others perhaps don't see, or pattern match, the patterns definitely started to emerge. And so I started to think of these patterns as maybe 5 dimensions of ADHD leadership. And look, you can call them whatever you like, or whatever it feels like resonates with you, maybe personalities or personas, archetypes, faces, facets, energies. Truthfully, honestly, I haven't really landed on how to best describe the grouping yet. It's still kind of really early days for me in this project, and I think, but what I found common to conversations with ADHD leaders was the lack of connection people had to historical leadership theory and structures. And so my ADHD is definitely overthinking and very hypersensitive with how to actually frame some of this moving ahead. And so I'm very keen to involve as many people as are willing to have conversations about this as we move forward, to start to think about how we might frame this up better. But what I did know was that I couldn't possibly come here and give a bunch of people with ADHD a verbal list of like 50 strengths and traits and expect them to remember any of them. And so I thought I needed to capture them up in something that was a fraction more pragmatic and memorable and relatable. So as they sort of, these strengths and traits and attributes came together through hundreds of conversations, what emerged was these kind of themes. The first was the vision ignition that sparks possibility. The second, a change catalyst, transforming what no longer serves. The third, the vibes detector, which is tuned into emotional currents. The fourth, a momentum machine that pushes things into action. And the fifth and last, a human multiplier that makes others shine brighter. And I guess for the vast majority of strengths, traits, and attributes that we could identify as things that were unique or common or real genuine strengths of leaders with ADHD, they fitted into one or more of these categories. So I think what's really important to understand at this point is that these aren't flaws to fix at all. They are opportunities to understand, and they are capabilities to capitalize on. They're ways of leading that, I guess, were never meant to fit into a very narrow mold of traditional leadership. And they aren't traditional leadership styles that you'll find in textbooks, but they most definitely share traits with emerging trends in what people say it looks like to be a modern leader. They show us that leadership isn't about ticking boxes or meeting stereotypes, but that it's about showing up as yourself with your particular brand of brilliance and learning how to manage the friction that comes along the way. And so you might start to, as we're going to pull through them in a minute, and you might start to recognize yourself in one of these 5 or a blend of all of them, I hope. And that's kind of the point, that you don't have to pick one and stay there, but that the future of leadership actually genuinely relies on agility, which is probably an advantage for those of us with ADHD. Perhaps you could consider them as 5 companions, like maybe mirrors to remind you that you aren't alone, and perhaps 2, I guess, maybe tools to help you see that the thing that makes you different, your spark, isn't, in this case, a liability. It's actually what leadership looks like. So let's start with the vision ignition. I think of this kind of ADHD leader as one who starts the fire that makes the future possible. And I think every movement or all momentum begins with ignition. It's that flash of energy, that idea, the possibility that makes people sit up a little straighter and wonder, I wonder what if. The vision ignition is, I guess, the ADHD leader that brings the spark. We light up a room with our imagination. We make even the impossible feel worth chasing to others, to teams, to colleagues, to the people around us. Our brilliance, I think, is in the starting. We know how to begin big, gnarly, hard conversations, how to launch big ideas and projects, how to inspire movements, I think. The presence of an ADHD vision igniter can turn apathy into excitement, and I think hesitation into hope. And people gather around us, not because we have all the answers, because for most of us, we're often willing to accept that we totally don't. But I think it's that we make people believe that the answers exist. And we see a future in a way that's really, that's visionary, that's creative, and that's innovative, which is often, I think, why we end up finding ourselves in careers that are aligned with creativity, with innovation, and with entrepreneurship. But of course, there's a flip side. With all of these, there's a flip side. And that is that, ignition can fizzle or it can flare too hot. The challenge for ADHD leaders who ignite vision is definitely about learning which sparks are worth tending and sort of turning into a bigger fire or flame, and which ones are best perhaps left to fade out, I think. Too many flames at once and we might fill a room with smoke, we might get too excited, and for the vast majority of people might understand what that might be like. And I guess too few and the energy might kind of die off before it's even started. So if you're a vision, if you are the vision ignition as an ADHD leader, your leadership lies not just in starting, but I think in starting movements. So the next one's the change catalyst. And I think ADHD leaders, these are the kind of ADHD leaders who break what holds us back and who build what moves us forward. And that's really what transformation looks like, right? So some leaders are natural catalysts and they look at rules and traditions and hierarchies that others take for granted. And I think their first instinct is to ask why, which is, I think, a very common and on-brand ADHD question. These kind of leaders notice when systems are serving themselves instead of other people, and they can't help but to push for something better. This is a really, really core trait of ADHD leadership, and something I spent a lot of time talking with others about was disruption and change, and being comfortable with those things and being comfortable with the messy middle. I think the change catalyst's brilliance comes in transformation. We work to sort of clear pathways that have been blocked for too long. We unlock innovation, we open spaces and welcome spaces for new voices. We challenge the culture of that's just how it's always been done, which is maybe the most frustrating thing that one could say to, well, me at least, but I suspect many leaders with ADHD. And we champion for the concept, I think, that systems are made by people, and as a result, they can be remade or rebuilt by people. But I think the reality is that catalyzing change can also have consequences. And I think ADHD leaders who carry this change catalyst capability know this, that done without care, that change can leave people feeling really unsettled. It can be confusing, it can create defensiveness, and it can create a level of resistance that kind of slows progress instead of speeding it up for people who don't feel comfortable with change. And so for change catalysts, for ADHD leaders who are change catalysts, I think the challenge is to pair both the sort of the courage with the ability to care and the necessity to care, to be able to spark transformation whilst also sort of growing the trust in what comes next. And so if this resonates with you, being a change catalyst, your leadership probably not just, your leadership lies in not just challenging what is and the why, but in building the belief that whatever the change is and whatever the future is better than where you currently are. The vibes detector. Let's talk about that, right? This is the feel everything leader. This is the ADHD leader who literally has a finger on the pulse for people and who uses empathy as a radar. This was a really common discussion point, and interestingly, often something that people told me that they had been criticised for, and that wasn't a reflection of strong leadership. I beg to differ. So some leaders don't just think their way through a concept, but they actually feel their way through a challenge. And I think this was really common as a discussion point. We noticed that unspoken tension in a room. We are intuitive, and we sense the mood sometimes, often before words are even spoken. And we sort of hold that instinctive understanding of what it is that people need, both by being willing to listen generously, but also by the things that we pick up along the way. And so an ADHD vibes detector leader leads with empathy, the kind of empathy that builds fierce loyalty and deep trust amongst the teams and colleagues that are around them. And I think the brilliance here is in the connection. Teams feel safe, they feel seen, they feel valued under the care of an ADHD leader. We create cultures where people can bring their whole self to work. And we heard people talk about these things, or even to the education space. We heard Claire and Ollie and Shay and others talk about these things earlier. And part of it is because we model what it means to be human and still lead. But of course, what is clear that is that, a concern, the challenge here is that turning every one of these, or tuning into each one of these vibes or feelings can mean carrying a lot. The weight of others' emotions, the exhaustion of the constant empathy or over-empathy, the blurred boundaries between caring and potentially over-caring. At points, it can feel like drowning in everyone else's currents and problems. And so if being a vibes detector resonates with your leadership style, it relies on not just sensing, but I think setting boundaries that protect your own energy whilst you lead with heart. Let's talk about the momentum maker. It's that ADHD leader that turns vision into velocity, that gets things kicking. Am I right? I think some leaders can't sit still. And, I guess that's probably good news for those of us with the hyperactive, inattentive, or combined type ADHD, right? Waiting for perfect isn't really in our DNA. We'd rather move, test, adapt, keep moving, change, and get to the place that we need to get to as quickly as possible so we can move on to the next thing that delivers us a dopamine hit. The momentum machine thrives on progress, and it's those hits of dopamine along the way that keep us motivated. Because I think perhaps because we're often not afraid of tricky or complex, we're often the ones that get stuck projects unstuck, who push big ideas into action with very little fear, and who make things happen when other people are still busy in that planning phase. Our brilliance is genuinely in acceleration, turning strategy into traction as quickly as we can, which also perhaps explains why we've heard that people work in the kinds of businesses that help, and I think Claire's business perhaps, help people do this exact thing. We notice when the team needs momentum. I guess it can come with risks too, though, right? Charging ahead can create chaos. It means we can skim over detail. We've heard people talk about that already today, or leave colleagues breathless trying to keep up. And so for people who resonate with being a momentum machine, I think the challenge is really not so much about pressing pause, but about knowing when and how to press pause when it's required, and to notice when people or your team need a breather to catch up or a clearer map to pace forward. And so I think if you're an ADHD leader who resonates as a momentum machine, your leadership lies not just in driving forward, but in pacing the journey so others can keep up and move along with you. And then there's the human multiplier. The ADHD leader with the mad skills radar, the one who knows exactly how to make others shine brighter. These are the leaders that don't shine because of the things that they achieve alone, but shine really brightly because of what they help others to achieve, what they enable others to achieve. Human multipliers, ADHD leaders as human multipliers, they are talent spotters, they are strength amplifiers, they make space for others, and they invest in people. We understand that the return in people investment is exponential, and that an individual's growth and performance becomes a team's success and a business's ability to transform and deliver. So I think the brilliance of an ADHD leader who is a human multiplier is absolutely enablement and empowerment. And what we know about this kind of leadership, and what was very common to discussions, was their ability to actually capitalize on the strengths and traits of people in teams around them and shape positions specifically for them. But of course, we know being a tremendous advocate for others comes, and an identifier of skills and traits and strengths in others comes at a cost. And that is that in giving energy outwards, sometimes an ADHD leader who's a multiplier can kind of neglect their own needs. And I think one of the things that was very common in conversations with ADHD leaders was our ability to be both a tremendous advocate for others and a pretty hopeless one for ourselves. So it's something definitely to keep an eye on. And I think if it resonates with you, being a human multiplier as an ADHD leader, that what's really important is that your leadership strength lies not just in lifting others, but I think in remembering that you too deserve to grow, and deserve the advocacy that others get and that you supply for others. So you might have found yourself nodding, I hope, through one or many of these personas, thinking, yeah, that's totally me, great. And maybe you saw a bit of yourself in all of them, sometimes a vision igniter, sometimes a momentum machine, maybe all of them at different points. And that's kind of the beauty of it, I think. They're not fixed. They're not boxes to climb into or stay put. They're really lenses and a language, and a reminder that the way you lead, whether it's messy or fiery or heartfelt or relentless or human, it's not wrong. We are simply wired differently. In fact, we are wired to lead. Some days your ignition might need fanning. That's okay. Other days your vibe detector might be exhausted. It's also okay. Rest is fine. And sometimes you might genuinely just catalyze the change that completely starts something new. I think most importantly, though, knowing that wherever you land here, you're not alone, that these things were common to so many people I talk to, and that these strengths and capabilities are shared by ADHD leaders around the world. Leaders who, like you, are trying to work out how to turn what once felt, I guess, like friction into fuel for the future. So, like I said at the beginning, I guess this is really just the start for this project. And I hope it's the start to what will become a love letter to ADHD leaders globally. And there's lots of work still to be done. The next phase of research that I'm working on here looks like really developing full strengths and attributes profiles to help people capitalize on what makes us uniquely us, to start to build out some strategies to help navigate when the fuel sort of turns to flames and what that flip side looks like and where we can find ourselves getting into trouble as ADHD leaders. The development of really tried and tested set of practical tips, tricks and tools for modern leaders and aspiring leaders. And I guess a reimagined narrative for all of you to start to feel seen and heard and valued and empowered and understood as leaders. And so I guess with that, I would just like to thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about this project with you all, and to say that there are lots of ways in which you can continue to follow this project, which I hope turns into something more significant in the next little bit that I would be able to tell you a little bit more about. But you can jump onto my website. You can find me on Instagram at Sparkle Ideas Lab, or you can find me on LinkedIn, Dr. Hannah Brown. So thank you so much for the opportunity to share my story with you all.
Hannah, thank you. There's a million questions to ask, and sadly not the time to ask them right now. I would encourage anyone to send any questions you have for Hannah to info@adhdaustralia.org.au, and you've got your own LinkedIn profile as well where people can contact you, yeah, Hannah?
Yeah, they certainly can. If you just type in Dr. Hannah Brown, you will find me there.
That would be awesome. Thank you so much for your time.